Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing the book Orphan Train Children, Aggie's Home by Joan Lowery Nixon. It's one of the books which I'm reading for middle grade March, and it fits the prompt to read a book about an orphan, although I'm not quite sure Aggie is properly an orphan. We just don't know exactly what happened to her parents, but she does essentially live the life of an orphan throughout the book. And as I discovered, Mrs. Nixon has written quite a few books about children who took part in the orphan trains, which ran from 1854 to 1929, so it's really a subject in American history which really fascinated her, and hopefully if time allows enough on the recording, I will be reading the historical information which she provides in the book about these orphan trains. It's not really, that much like detailed information, but it's just, interesting to have background about this. And so anyway, here's the synopsis. Aggie Mae Vaughn is 12 years old in 1866, and she lives in the asylum for homeless waifs in New York City. Aggie hates being called a waif almost as much as she hates the asylum, where she's always in trouble. Now she's going west on the orphan train, and she doesn't know what to expect. What is it like to live in a real home? Will she be treated like a daughter or like a worker? And most of all, will anyone want her? Now the book officially starts when Aggie is 8 years old, although most of it takes place when she's 12 years old, and it's her first day in the asylum for homeless waifs. I Googled it afterwards. It appears to be fictional, but obviously it was based on real asylums for orphans. And at this time in history, orphans and just children in general, but particularly orphans and children from the working class and the poor, they were treated really, really horribly. And of course, this is also an era when corporal punishment is the rule and not the extreme rare exception if it, God forbid, has to happen at all. And so Aggie is constantly having her hands beaten with a wooden ruler by Mrs. Marchlander, the, pardon my German, Affenschwanz, who runs the asylum she's in, because she's not unnaturally well behaved and following all the rules exactly. She's not happy to be a mindless drone who's the so-called lady and doing whatever she's told. She's not interested in being trained to be a seamstress and sewing all day long, and she doesn't really have much of an education either. She knows how to read and write, but they're not really schooling these orphans either. It's just treating them so horribly because they dared not to be born into bourgeois or rich families, and they don't have parents to claim and name them. And so when Aggie is in the orphanage for the first time, she sneaks into the Mrs. Marchlander's desk, and she takes out the envelope with her information in it, and she finds a note from her mother. And it also, she learns her birth date, and she finds out her mother really, wanted to have her, and she only gave her up to a foundling hospital when she was 10 days old because she couldn't care for her at all. And a lot of these children who ended up in orphanages, they really did have parents and families and such. They were only handed over because of extreme dire poverty. And in this era, many of them weren't necessarily, so-called illegitimate children. I hate that term, but that unfortunately was the common word used in that era. And also in the orphan trains, this would be particular interesting point because they knew these children were born to married parents, and that's why they wanted to adopt them when they came west, because if you found out a child was, God forbid, born to unmarried parents, many people did not want to adopt them at all. And if they came to find out later someone they knew or a child that they had adopted was so-called illegitimate, that was just a horrible, disgusting scandal, totally just beneath so-called decent society. So anyway, Aggie keeps so-called acting up at this home, and Mrs. Marchlander is finally really getting sick of her and sends her off to the Children's Aid Society, which was a real organization. There's someone much nicer there who's taking care of her and promising to send her to a happier home. Frances Mary Kelly and Miss Kelly. And when Aggie is put on the orphan train after a short while in the Children's Aid Society, since she's the oldest child, she's told she can help with taking care of all the younger children on the train. And they're going to make 3 stops in Missouri. They did send the children to all sorts of states. Many of them were adopted by families who lived right in New York State, but not in the city, because the people who came up with the idea for the orphan train, they thought it would be a wonderful, morally uplifting, better life for these orphans and poor children who were abandoned and given up by their families because of just dire, extreme circumstances. They thought they would be so much better if they lived in the countryside with open air, big wide open spaces, just, sunshine not being packed into a tenement. And they also felt they would remove them from the life of crime or whatever they thought would be waiting for them in New York City. And so the train makes 3 stops in different cities in Missouri, which was kind of like the gatepost to the gateway to the West at that time, because this is still 1866. And so the Western states, there were obviously, pioneers and of course Native Americans living in them, but they just weren't like settled with like big, like permanent cities and such. And so Missouri was basically like the end of like so-called like American like civilization at the time, and beyond that was just like wilderness and homesteads and such for pioneers. And so anyway, there are 3 stops in Missouri, and many of the children are chosen at the first stop, and then most of the rest are chosen at the second stop. But Aggie still isn't chosen at all. Many people like don't want her because of her haircut. They don't think it's like feminine or flattering enough, and she's not wearing a big hair bow in her hair, and she's not like well behaved. She doesn't like them looking at her like a horse up at auction, or doesn't want to be chosen as a farmhand or just an unpaid grunt worker, like some person to do like labor around the farm. But then she is chosen by an older couple at the last stop, Mr. and Mrs. Braden, and turns out they already have 8 children. There are only 2 left at home: Leon, who's 17 years old, and Penelope, who's 22 years old. And they're kind of like the black sheep of their community because they're so nonconformist and against the grain. Leon is sort of like a mad scientist. He's always like inventing things, coming up with these great ideas, but unfortunately they're always like thought up by someone else who patents them and like brings them to the public before he has a chance to, and then he immediately begins working on other things, and he has some accidents during his inventing. But I'll let you read the book to find out exactly if you're interested in Penelope. A lot of people like kind of shun her because she's big into women's suffrage, like getting women the vote, and she like doesn't wear a hat in public, and she is a so-called spinster. Or I call myself a spinster because that's a term I've reclaimed, but in those days they used the even uglier word old maid, because God forbid a woman in her 20s not be married and a mother yet. That's just like totally beyond the pale and such. And Aggie is kind of hesitant to belong to a real family, even one who's treating her like very nicely, because she doesn't really know how to be in a family and like live with like people in a house like that. So it's like a totally new experience for her, and she still has like some unresolved trauma from being abused so much at the orphanage. But gradually she grows to like the family, even though she's still very hesitant given her background. I thought it was a really sweet story, although it is obviously even for middle grade kind of short. I would peg this as like lower middle grade, despite Aggie being 12 years old. So I guess it's one of those cases you like kind of write down a little bit because of kids who are reading up. So like the target audience for this book wouldn't be like 12-year-olds. It might be like 8 or 10-year-olds who want to read about an older kid. I have many thoughts about deliberately writing down, but so like younger kids can read up about a character who is older than they are. But anyway, I really hope I haven't been rambling too much during this book review, but many people don't even like watch my book reviews all the way through or commenting on them anyway, so maybe I'm just wasting my time worrying. So this is one of the reproductions of an advertisement in the book, showing like about the orphan trains and such, different ages. They've been like tested and found to be well-meaning, anxious for homes. Come and hear the address, remember the time and place. They'll be properly clothed, treated as members of the family, given proper school and advantages. And they were, taken to all sorts of states all over the country. It's not just a kind of a popular misconception or myth that they were only taken out west to live on farms and such. As I mentioned, many of them stayed right in New York State or in like the nearby states in New England and the mid-Atlantic. And there's also some interesting like pictures in the back too. Like, for example, this one of on the Lower East Side. At the time, the Lower East Side was a much larger neighborhood. This was like years, like over a century before the northern portion of the neighborhood decided to like break away into the so-called East Village, which, by the way, is not a name many older residents of the Lower East Side recognize to this day. They just see, oh, it's just the upper part of the neighborhood that gentrified, and they got fancy ideas about being in Eastern Greenwich Village, but anyway, I know that's kind of off topic. And here, like the person who got the idea for the orphan trains, and here's some boys on board an orphan train, and a group of children ready to meet the orphan train. And these were some statistics about the states the orphans ended up going to. And unfortunately, because of the era, again, many of the children who went out there were like siblings, but they were like split up because unfortunately they didn't always necessarily want to take all the siblings into the same family. So that was just, something really like sad and unfortunate. It was just like an unfortunate fact of life. So anyway, here are the historical information if you don't mind. In 1850, there were 500,000 people living in New York City. 10,000 of these people were homeless children. Many of these children were immigrants. They had come to the United States with their families from other countries. Many lived in one-room apartments. These rooms had stoves for heating and cooking, but the only water was in troughs in the hallways. These apartments were called tenements, and they were often crowded together in neighborhoods. Immigrant parents worked long hours for very low wages. Sometimes they had barely enough money to buy food. Everyone in the family over the age of 10 was expected to work. Few of these children could attend school, and many could not read or write. Girls took in bundles of cloth from clothing manufacturers. They carefully sewed men's shirts, women's blouses, and babies' gowns. Or they made paper flowers and tried to sell them on the busy streets. Boys shined shoes or sold newspapers. There were no wonder medicines in the 1800s. Many immigrants who lived in poor conditions died from contagious diseases. Children often became orphans with no one to care for them. Some orphan children were taken in by aunts and uncles, but many of the immigrant children had no relatives to come to their aid. They had left their grandparents, aunts, and uncles in other countries. They were alone. No one in the government had developed any plans for caring for them. These orphans were evicted from their homes so that the rooms could be rented to other families. Orphans with no homes and no beds slept in alleys. This was a time in which children were expected to work hard, along with adults. They were expected to take care of themselves, but there were not enough jobs for all the orphans in New York City. Many street Arabs, as they were called, turned to lives of crime. Charles Loring Brace, a young minister and social worker, became aware of the situation. He worried about these children, who so badly needed care. With the help of some friends, he founded the Children's Aid Society. The Children's Aid Society provided a place to live for some of the homeless children. It also set up industrial schools to train the children of the very poor in job skills. Charles Loring Brace soon realized, however, that these steps were not enough. He came up with the idea of giving homeless orphan children a second, and much better, chance at life by taking them out of the city, placing them in homes in rural areas of the country. Brace hired a scout to visit some of the farm communities west of New York State. He asked the scout to find out if people would be interested in taking orphan children into their homes. The scout was surprised by how many people wanted the children. One woman wrote, "Last year was a very hard year, and we lost many of our children. Yes, we want your children. Please send your children." Brace went to orphans who were living on the streets and told them what he wanted to do. Children flocked to the Children's Aid Society office. "Take me," they begged. "Please take me." "Where do you live?" the children were asked. The answer was always the same. "Don't live nowhere." The first orphan train was sent west in 1856, and the last one in 1929. During these years, more than 150,000 children were taken out of New York City by the Children's Aid Society. Another 100,000 children were sent by trains to new homes in the West by the New York Foundling Home, which was not yet in existence at the time this story is set. I believe it was only created in 1869, and it's still in existence today, doing wonderful, wonderful, wonderful work in so many different areas, not just taking in children who are left on the steps by their very desperate mothers who would not give them up unless they were in a complete dire straits. By 1929, states had established welfare laws and had begun taking care of people in need, so the orphan trains were discontinued. Before a group of children was sent west by train, notices that the children were coming would be placed in the newspapers of towns along the route. "Wanted, homes for children," one notice said. It then listed the society's rules. Children were to be treated as members of the family. They were to be taken to church on Sundays and sent to school until they were 14. And I went doing a little research afterwards. I found, unfortunately, a lot of Catholic children were deliberately placed into Protestant homes, which is, kind of really like sleazy. It's like taking away their home, like religion, like shattering that connection to their birth families, which is, just as bad as changing a child's name when he or she is like old enough to remember and has a sense of oneself as, having that family name, just like making that child no longer speak native language. And then unfortunately all these horrible things did happen to many orphans in the past, and also there wasn't always necessarily very thorough screening of these people. So many times, possibly, God forbid, a child could be taken in by terrible abusers or people who just wanted exploited labor around the farm. They didn't care a whit about, that child's emotional state, or they only wanted like a beautiful, like pretty child, and they didn't care about like the any of the like children who weren't necessarily photogenic, but what else is new? Lots of people these days, they only want like a perfect like blonde haired like blue-eyed baby, and like screw anyone else who doesn't fit that like perfection of looking at that they're interested in. I'm sorry if I'm rambling. Handbills were posted in the towns where the orphan train stopped, where people could easily see them. One said, "Children without homes." A number of the children brought from New York are still without homes. Friends from the country, please call and see them. A committee of local citizens would be chosen in each of the towns. The members of the committee were given the responsibility, making sure that the people who took the orphan train children in were good people. Most committee members tried to do a good job, but sometimes a child was placed in a home that turned out to be unhappy. Some farmers wanted free labor and were unkind to the boys they chose, but there were many good people who wanted to provide loving homes to the orphans. Many people were so happy with their children that they took a step beyond being foster parents and legally adopted them. Not all of the children who were taken west on the orphan trains were orphans. Some had one or both parents still living, but sometimes fathers and mothers brought their children to the Children's Aid Society. "I can't take care of my children," they would say. "I want them to have a much better life than I can give them. Please take them west to a new home." What did the orphan train children think about their new lives? What made the biggest impression on them? They were used to living in small spaces, surrounded by many people in a noisy, crowded city. Were they overwhelmed by the sight of miles of open countryside? No, and I guess like these, thought questions are intended obviously more for the target age readers of the book, like just think about what they would have wanted yourself. It's not really meant for like adult readers who might be reading this. And this is also another reproduction of an ad. I'm sorry, I'm still camera like reverses from my angle, and just this was from the Children's Aid Society on St. Mark's Place, which is in the lower, well, it was in the Lower East Side at the time. Now it's part of the so-called East Village. And anyway, this was just a cute, sweet book if you're looking for that kind of like historical thing for a reluctant reader or someone of the lower middle grade age who might be interested in it. And Mrs. Nixon, as I mentioned, does have a number of other books about children who went on the orphan trains, and I don't know those are necessarily written on the same like writing level, or they're for like more like older middle grade students. So anyway, if you're like interested in this topic, I would encourage you to check it out, or the other books which were written by Mrs. Nixon. And on my next vlog, which possibly will be tomorrow, I'll be reviewing this book, which I chose for the contemporary prompt. It's novel in verse, but as I quickly discovered, it's not really a contemporary setting, though it was published just last year. It's set in the 1980s about an Indian American girl, and I really, really enjoyed it. It's a very powerful, emotional book. So see you guys again very soon, and please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you very much for watching to the end if you have. Thanks. Bye.